The ink on the document was barely dry when the laughter started. It was a cold, cruel sound that bounced off the mahogany walls of the lawyer's office. Richard looked at his wife, Julia, with eyes full of triumphant malice. He believed he had just tricked her into signing away her future, leaving her destitute while he claimed his father's billion-dollar empire. He thought she was weak. He thought she was foolish. But Richard forgot one crucial detail. His father, the late Henry Sterling, saw everything, and in the safe behind the lawyer's desk sat a second envelope, one that would turn Richard's laughter into a scream. This is the story of how greed became a trap, and how the one who signed away everything ended up owning it all. The rain over Seattle was relentless, a grey curtain that seemed to weep for the passing of Henry Caldwell. But inside the Caldwell estate, the mood was far from mournful. It was hungry. Julia stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the library, watching the black limousines snake down the long, winding driveway. She wore a simple black dress, one she had owned for years. It was modest, unassuming, much like Julia herself had been forced to become over the last 5 years of her marriage to Richard Caldwell. "Stop hovering, Julia. You look like a ghost." A sharp voice cut through the silence. Julia turned to see Beatrice, her mother-in-law, sipping a martini as if it were water. Beatrice was a woman who wore diamonds to breakfast and regarded empathy as a character flaw. She sat on the velvet sofa, her legs crossed, inspecting her manicure. "I was just watching the guests leave, Beatrice," Julia said softly. "It was a beautiful service. Henry would have liked it." "Henry is dead," Beatrice snapped, not looking up. "What he would have liked is irrelevant now. What matters is the legacy, and ensuring it remains in capable hands." The double door swung open, and Richard strode in. He was a handsome man, with the kind of jawline that graced magazine covers, but his eyes were hard, devoid of the warmth his father had possessed. He loosened his tie, tossing his jacket onto a chair with an air of arrogant exhaustion. "Finally," Richard exhaled, pouring himself a drink. "I thought old man Jenkins was going to eulogize for another hour. We get it. Dad was a saint. He built an empire. Now can we get to the business?" Julia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Richard, your father was buried 2 hours ago. Can't this wait?" Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He walked over to Julia, towering over her. "Wait? For what? Sentimentality doesn't keep the stock price up, Julia. The board is jittery. They need to know the transition is seamless. They need to know I am in control." He ran a finger down her cheek, but it wasn't a caress. It felt more like an inspection. "Besides, we have loose ends to tie up. Mr. Henderson is waiting in the study." "Mr. Henderson?" Julia asked. "The family attorney." "The executor," Beatrice corrected from the sofa. "And he has the will." Julia nodded. She had expected this. She knew Henry had been wealthy, a shipping magnate who controlled most of the logistics on the West Coast, but she had never cared about the money. Henry had been the only one in this house who treated her with kindness. While Richard spent his nights working late, and Beatrice treated her like unpaid help, Henry had played chess with her, asked about her day, and encouraged her painting. "Go on then," Richard said, gesturing toward the study door. "Let's get it over with." The study was a room that smelled of old paper and expensive cigars. Mr. Henderson, a man with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat behind Henry's massive oak desk. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Please sit," Henderson said, his voice grave. Richard took the leather armchair front and center. Beatrice sat next to him. Julia took the smaller chair in the corner, trying to make herself invisible. "As you know," Henderson began, opening a thick leather portfolio. Henry was a meticulous man. He updated his will 3 weeks before his passing. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. 3 weeks? He didn't mention that. He wanted to ensure his assets were protected, Henderson said carefully. He was aware of the tensions within the family. Tensions? Beatrice scoffed. There are no tensions, just a grieving widow and a dutiful son ready to take the helm. Henderson adjusted his glasses. We shall see. Now the estate is vast. Real estate holdings in New York, London, and Tokyo. The shipping fleets. The liquefied natural gas ventures. And of course, the liquid capital. Richard leaned forward, his greed practically radiating off him. Cut to the chase, Henderson. Everything goes to the next of kin. That's me. Usually, yes, Henderson said. However, Henry included a specific stipulation regarding Julia. Richard's head snapped toward his wife. Julia froze. Me? Yes, Henderson said. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the file. Before the main will can be read, Henry insisted that a specific contractual matter be resolved between Richard and Julia. Richard stood up, his face reddening. What kind of contract? We're married. What's mine is hers, theoretically, until I decide otherwise. Actually, Henderson said, his voice dropping an octave, Henry was concerned about the prenuptial agreement you forced Julia to sign 5 years ago. The one that stated she would receive nothing in the event of a divorce or death. That was standard protection, Beatrice shouted. She was a barista when he met her. We had to protect the family assets from gold diggers. Julia looked down at her hands. She remembered that day. Richard had told her it was just a formality to calm his mother down. He had promised it meant nothing, because they would be together forever. Henry found that document. Distasteful, Henderson said. So he created a new document, a waiver of spousal rights and claims. He wanted Julia to sign it now, before the reading of the will. Richard looked confused. Wait, you want her to sign a waiver? To waive her rights to the estate? Essentially, Henderson said. This document states that Julia voluntarily forfeits any claim to the Caldwell fortune, regardless of what the will might say. If she signs this, she walks away with nothing but her personal effects and a small stipend of $5,000. Richard's confusion melted into a grin. He looked at his mother, then at Julia. This was better than he hoped. His father, even in death, was helping him cut the dead weight. Henry must have finally realized that Julia didn't belong in their world. Give it to her, Richard commanded. Henderson slid the paper across the desk toward Julia. Julia, I must advise you. You are under no legal obligation to sign this. If you refuse, we proceed to the reading of the will as normal. Julia looked at the paper. It was short, brutal. I, Julia Caldwell, hereby waive all rights. Sign it, Julia, Richard said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Why? Julia asked, her voice trembling. Why would Henry want this? Because he knew, Richard laughed, pacing the room. He knew you were never one of us. He knew I wanted a divorce, Julia. I've been waiting until he passed to do it, out of respect. But he's saving me the trouble. Sign it, take your $5,000, and get out. If you don't, he leaned in close to her ear. I will make sure the lawyers tie you up in court until you starve. You won't get a dime, and you'll drown in legal fees. This is the only way you leave with your dignity. Julia looked at Henderson. The lawyer's face was stone. He offered no help. She looked at Beatrice, who was smirking. Then she looked at Richard, the man she had once loved. the man who had turned cold and cruel the moment the ring was on her finger. She realized then that she didn't want his money. She didn't want his empire. She just wanted to be free of them. "If I sign this," Julia whispered, "I'm free, no more threats, no more litigation." "Free as a bird," Richard sneered, "and broke as one too." Julia picked up the pen. Her hand shook, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming release. She didn't care about the billions. She had her pride. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed, "Julia Caldwell." Richard clapped his hands together, a thunderous sound in the quiet room. "Brilliant! Absolutely brilliant!" He snatched the paper from under her hand and waved it in the air. "Did you see that, Mother? She signed it. She actually signed it." Beatrice chuckled. "A fool to the end." Richard turned to Henderson, slamming the waiver down on the desk. "File that. Now, read the will. Let's see exactly how much richer I am." Henderson picked up the signed waiver. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully into a separate folder. He closed the portfolio. Then he reached into the safe behind him and pulled out a thick, red envelope sealed with wax. "Very well," Henderson said. "The condition has been met. We may now proceed with the reading of the last will and testament of Henry Caldwell." Richard poured himself another drink, his back to the lawyer. "Go on, Henderson. Don't bore us. The house, the stocks, the fleet. Just list it out." "I will read the preamble first," Henderson said. His voice changed. It became stronger, more authoritative. "I, Henry Caldwell, being of sound mind, do hereby make this statement. I have built an empire on the principles of foresight and character. I have spent my life watching those around me. I have seen greed, and I have seen grace." Richard rolled his eyes. Classic Dad. Always the philosopher. "I have also watched my son, Richard," Henderson continued reading. Richard paused, the glass halfway to his lips. "I have watched him treat his wife with contempt. I have watched him embezzle funds from the charitable foundation to pay for his mistress in Monaco." The room went deathly silent. Beatrice gasped. Richard spun around, his face pale. "That's a lie. I have watched my wife, Beatrice, encourage this behavior," Henderson read on, his voice unyielding. "And I have watched Julia, a woman who nursed me when I was sick, who listened when I was lonely, and who never asked for a penny despite the cruelty she endured." "This is ridiculous," Richard stammered. He was senile. He didn't know what he was writing. "Therefore," Henderson read, "I constructed a test, the waiver Julia just signed." Richard froze. "The waiver? That was to cut her out." "No," Henderson said, looking over his spectacles. "The waiver was the key." He flipped to the next page of the will. "If Julia refuses to sign the waiver and fights for the money, she proves herself to be motivated by greed, just like the others. In that case, the estate is to be divided equally among charities, and Richard receives the shipping company." Henderson paused. "But," he continued, "if Julia signs the waiver, if she chooses her dignity and freedom over the promise of wealth, if she proves that she is truly the selfless woman I believe her to be, then the waiver triggers Clause 7A. "What is Clause 7A? Beatrice whispered, her hands gripping her pearls. Henderson looked directly at Richard. Clause 7A states, "Because she signed away everything, proving she deserves it all, I hereby declare the previous prenuptial agreement null and void. I hereby disinherit my son, Richard Caldwell, and my wife, Beatrice Caldwell, leaving them only the statutory minimum required by state law. I bequeath the entirety of the Caldwell estate, including all properties, assets, and majority controlling interest in Caldwell Shipping, to my daughter-in-law, Julia Caldwell. She is the sole heiress." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. For 10 seconds, no one breathed. The rain lashed against the windows, sounding like applause from the grave. Richard dropped his glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, whiskey splashing over his expensive Italian shoes. You're joking. This is a sick joke." "I assure you, Richard, I am not known for my humor," Henderson said calmly. He pushed a button on his desk, and the heavy oak doors opened. 2 large men in dark suits stepped in. Private security. "What is this?" Beatrice shrieked, standing up. "You can't do this. We are the Caldwells. She is nobody." "She is the owner of this house, Mrs. Caldwell," Henderson said. "And as the executor of the estate, it is my duty to inform you that Julia, excuse me, Miss Caldwell, has the right to decide who remains on the premises." Richard lunged at the desk, grabbing the will. "Give me that. I'll tear it up. I'll burn it." The security guards moved instantly, one of them catching Richard by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Richard yelped, his face smashed against the bookshelf. "Let go of me. Do you know who I am?" Richard screamed. "We know who you were," Henderson said, closing the file. "You were the heir. Now you are a trespasser." Julia sat in the corner, her hands covering her mouth. She couldn't process the words. The entirety? Everything? She looked at Richard, pinned against the books he never read, and Beatrice, who was hyperventilating on the sofa. "Julia!" Richard shouted, spit flying from his mouth. Tell them this is insanity. You can't run this company. You don't know anything about business. You'll ruin us." Julia slowly stood up. Her legs felt weak, but something inside her chest was hardening. It was the steel that Henry had seen in her, even when she hadn't seen it herself. "I might not know shipping, Richard," Julia said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I know people, and I know right from wrong." "You signed the waiver?" Richard, desperate, his eyes wild. "You signed it. It's a legal document." "Which triggered the clause," Henderson reminded him. "The waiver was a conditional trigger. By signing it, she activated her inheritance. It was Henry's masterstroke. He gambled on her character, Richard, and he bet against yours." "I'll sue," Richard roared. "I'll drag this through court for 20 years. I'll hire the best lawyers in the country." Henderson smiled, a rare, thin smile. "With what money, Richard? Your personal accounts were frozen this morning, pending the audit of the charitable foundation. The embezzlement evidence has already been sent to the district attorney." Richard's face went from red to a ghostly white. The DA? "Henry left nothing to chance," Henderson said. "He wanted you to have a fresh start. In prison, perhaps." Beatrice let out a wail and slumped back onto the sofa. "My reputation. The gala next week. I can't be seen like this." Julia walked over to the desk. She looked at Henderson. "Is this real, all of it?" "It is, Miss Caldwell. The house, the accounts, the company. It is all yours. Effective immediately." Henderson handed her a set of keys. "These are to the master suite and the corporate office." Julia took the keys. They felt cold and heavy. She turned to the security guards. "Please escort Richard and Beatrice out." "Out?" Beatrice gasped. "But it's raining. Where will we go?" "I'm sure you have friends who can take you in," Julia said, echoing the words Beatrice had said to her when Julia's own mother had fallen ill and needed a place to stay. "After all, you're a Caldwell. That must count for something." "You ungrateful little witch," Beatrice hissed. "Remove them," Julia ordered. As the guards dragged a struggling Richard and a sobbing Beatrice toward the door, Richard looked back, his eyes filled with a pure, toxic hatred. "This isn't over, Julia," he screamed, his voice echoing down the hallway. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started. You have no idea who we owe money to. You're not inheriting a fortune, you stupid girl. You're inheriting a death sentence." The doors slammed shut, cutting off his threats. Silence returned to the study. "What did he mean?" Julia asked, looking at Henderson. "Who do they owe money to?" Henderson's expression darkened slightly. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Richard made some imprudent investments with people who do not use the legal system to collect their debts." "Mobsters?" Julia asked, her breath catching. "Let's just say private lenders with aggressive tactics," Henderson said. "But don't worry. The estate is powerful. We have security. You are safe." But Julia remembered the look in Richard's eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was fear. Desperate fear. "I need to know everything, Mr. Henderson," Julia said, sitting in the chair Richard had just vacated. "If I'm the CEO, I need to know exactly what mess he's left me." Henderson nodded. "It will be a long night, Julia." It was indeed. As Henderson walked her through the files, Julia began to realize that Henry hadn't just left her a fortune. He had left her a war. Richard had been laundering money through the shipping containers, and the people he was laundering for, a cartel known as the Obsidian Syndicate, would not be happy that their puppet was gone and a barista was now in charge. The phone on the desk rang. It was a private line, one that only Henry used. Henderson stared at it. "That line hasn't rung in 6 months." Julia reached out. "Hello?" A voice, distorted and deep, came through the receiver. "Congratulations on the inheritance, Mrs. Caldwell. We were fond of Richard, but we hear he's indisposed. We look forward to continuing our arrangement with you." "Who is this?" Julia asked, her grip tightening on the phone. "We are your partners," the voice said, "and we have a shipment arriving at Dock 4 tomorrow night. Don't be late, or the next funeral at the estate will be yours." The line went dead. Julia slowly hung up the phone. She looked out the window at the storm raging outside. Richard was gone, but the sharks were still circling. "Mr. Henderson," Julia said, standing up, "call the security team and get me the file on Dock 4. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a target. But as she looked at her reflection in the dark window, she didn't see the scared girl who had signed the waiver. She saw the sole heiress, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The drive to the port of Seattle was a blur of neon lights and torrential rain. Julia sat in the back of Henry's armored Mercedes, her hands trembling in her lap. Next to her, Henderson was reviewing a digital manifest on a tablet, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow. "You do not have to do this, Julia," Henderson said, his voice low. "We can send the security team. You are the chairwoman now. You don't need to be on the ground." "If I don't go," Julia said, staring out at the passing street lamps, "they will think I'm weak. Richard was weak. That's why they owned him. I need them to know that the rules have changed." The car turned off the main highway and navigated through the labyrinth of shipping containers stacked like rust-colored skyscrapers. Dock 4 was located at the far end of the terminal, a desolate stretch of concrete where the shadows seemed to have weight. The Mercedes came to a halt. 2 security SUVs flanked them. The doors opened, and the smell of salt water, diesel, and rotting fish hit Julia instantly. It was a visceral, grounding scent. Standing under the flickering halogen light of a warehouse bay was a group of 3 men. They wore expensive trench coats that looked out of place among the grime of the shipyard. "Stay close to me," the head of security, a towering man named Frank Bishop, instructed. Julia stepped out into the rain, opening a black umbrella. She walked toward the men, her heels clicking rhythmically on the wet pavement. The man in the center stepped forward. He was in his 50s, with silver hair slicked back and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a banker who enjoyed hunting big game. This was Victor Kincaid, a name Henderson had whispered with fear in the car. "Mrs. Caldwell," Kincaid said, his voice smooth like oiled leather. "My condolences on your loss, and my congratulations on your acquisition." "Mr. Kincaid," Julia replied, keeping her chin high. "Mr. Henderson tells me we have a scheduling conflict." Kincaid smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No conflict, my dear. Just business. Your husband, your late husband's son, had an agreement with us. Container 89, Bravo. It bypasses customs. It bypasses inspection. It gets loaded onto the Caldwell Horizon, departing for Shanghai at 400 hours. Richard isn't running this company anymore," Julia said. "I am, and I don't move cargo without a manifest." Kincaid chuckled and lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind. "You seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It isn't. Richard was paid $5 million to ensure this container moves. He spent that money. Now, the service must be rendered." $5 million? Julia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "What is in the container, Mr. Kincaid?" Kincaid took a long drag. "The future, or the end of it, depending on who you ask. It's strictly hardware, proprietary tech, nothing that concerns a grieving widow." "Open it," Julia commanded. The air shifted. Kincaid's two bodyguards shifted their weight, their hands drifting toward the inside of their coats. Frank Bishop and the Caldwell security team tensed, hands hovering near their holsters. "I wouldn't recommend that," Kincaid said softly. "If it goes on my ship, under my flag, I see what it is," Julia said, stepping closer, invading his personal space. "Or the crane doesn't move. And if you shoot me right here, Mr. Kincaid, the police will be swarming this dock in 3 minutes. You'll lose your cargo and your freedom." Kincaid studied her. He was looking for the fear he had seen in Richard. He found fear, yes, but he also found something else, a reckless desperation. He signaled to one of his men. "Open it." The heavy metal doors of the rusted red container groaned as they were unlatched and swung open. Julia stepped forward, shining a flashlight into the dark cavern of the container. She expected drugs. She expected weapons. Instead, she saw people, dozens of them, huddled in the dark, shivering, eyes wide with terror. Women. Children. They were sitting on filthy blankets, surrounded by buckets of waste. Julia gagged, stumbling back. "Oh my God!" "Human cargo," Kincaid said, flicking his cigarette ash onto the wet ground. "Very lucrative." Richard didn't mind. He said labor is just another commodity. Rage, hot and blinding, exploded in Julia's chest. She turned on Kincaid. "You monster! You think I'm going to let this ship sail?" "I think you have no choice," Kincaid said, his voice turning hard. "You refuse, and we release the evidence that Caldwell Shipping has been doing this for 3 years. Your company assets will be seized. You will go to prison as the owner, or you let it go, just this once, and we renegotiate for the future." He leaned in close. "Be smart, Julia. Don't be a hero. Heroes die." Julia looked at the terrified faces in the container. Then she looked at Frank Bishop. She saw the disgust on her security chief's face. She made a decision. "Frank," Julia said, her voice shaking but loud, "close the container." Kincaid smiled. "Good girl. Close it," Julia continued, "and weld it shut. Then call the FBI." Kincaid's smile vanished. You make that call, and you're dead. If I'm dead, the email, scheduled to go out to the New York Times in 10 minutes with Richard's ledger attached, will be released automatically, Julia lied. She had no such email. She had no ledger. She was bluffing with everything she had. I found Richard's insurance file, she continued, her eyes locking onto Kincaid's. I know every name, every bribe, every drop location. You kill me, the whole syndicate burns. Kincaid stared at her. The rain hammered against the metal container, loud as gunfire. He was calculating the risk. If she really had the ledger, killing her would trigger a federal nightmare. You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Caldwell, Kincaid hissed. Get your men off my dock, Julia spat. Now! Kincaid glared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he signaled his men. This isn't over. You've just made enemies you can't imagine. They backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the container stacks. As soon as their tail lights vanished, Julia collapsed against the side of the car, her knees giving way. Frank caught her. Did you really have a ledger? Frank asked, supporting her weight. No, Julia whispered, shaking uncontrollably. I don't have anything. Get those people out of there, Frank. Get them food, blankets, and doctors, and call the authorities. But keep my name out of it for now. Yes, ma'am, Frank said, looking at her with a newfound respect. Julia climbed back into the car. She had won the battle, but she knew Kincaid was right. She had just started a war, and she needed ammunition. Fast. The next morning, the sun broke over the Seattle skyline, oblivious to the terror of the previous night. The Caldwell Tower stood, gleaming in the center of the financial district, a monument to Henry's ambition. Julia walked into the lobby wearing a sharp navy suit she had bought an hour ago. She felt like an imposter in the expensive fabric, but she wore it like armor. The employees fell silent as she passed. They had seen the news. Billionaire dies, son disinherited, unknown wife takes control. Whispers followed her to the elevator. That's her? I heard she was a waitress. I heard she seduced the old man. Julia ignored them. She took the private elevator to the 40th floor. The executive suite was chaotic. Phones were ringing off the hook. Lawyers were running back and forth with stacks of paper. When the elevator doors opened, she was met not by staff, but by Richard. He looked disheveled. He was wearing the same clothes from the funeral, stained and wrinkled. He had clearly not slept. He was arguing with the receptionist. I need to see her. She stole my life, Richard shouted. Richard, Julia said calmly, stepping out of the elevator. Richard spun around. His eyes were bloodshot. You ruined everything. Do you know what happened last night? Kincaid called me. He said you stopped the shipment. Are you insane? They're going to kill us. They're not going to kill us, Richard, Julia said, walking past him toward the CEO's office. They're going to look for the person who lost their money. That's you. Richard grabbed her arm. Frank Bishop, who had shadowed Julia all morning, stepped forward, but Julia held up a hand. She pulled her arm free. I saved those people, Richard, she said quietly. Human beings, children. How could you? It was money, Richard screamed, his voice cracking. It was just business. Dad built this company on blood. Don't you think he didn't? You think Henry was a saint? He knew. He turned a blind eye. Henry is dead, Julia said. I'm in charge now, and I don't turn a blind eye. You're going to bankrupt the company, Richard cried. The board is meeting right now. They're going to vote you out. You can't run this place. You don't have the experience. You don't have the degrees. You're nothing. Get him out of here, Julia told Frank. You can't do this, Richard yelled as security dragged him toward the elevators. I'm a Caldwell. This is my building. Julia walked into the main conference room. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind her, shutting out Richard's screams. 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around the long oval table. The board of directors. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. At the head of the table sat William Sterling, the chairman of the board. He was a man with a face like a bulldog and a reputation for ruthlessness. "Mrs. Caldwell," Sterling said, not standing up. "We were just discussing the instability caused by Henry's will. The stock dropped 6% this morning." "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Julia said. She didn't take a seat. She walked to the head of the table and stood next to him. "I imagine the market is nervous. Markets dislike change. The board feels that you are ill-equipped to handle the current crisis," Sterling said bluntly. "We have prepared a separation package, a very generous buyout. You step down as CEO, retain your shares as a silent partner, and let us appoint a professional to clean up this mess." He slid a folder toward her. Another waiver. Another contract trying to push her aside. Julia looked around the room. She saw the faces of people who had enabled Richard for years. People who likely knew about the smuggling, about the corruption. "I'm not signing anything," Julia said. "Mrs. Caldwell, be reasonable," a woman named Cynthia Vance said from the left. "You have zero corporate experience. We have creditors calling. We have a PR nightmare. You are a liability." "I am the owner," Julia corrected, "and I spent last night at the docks, stopping a shipment of human trafficking that this board allowed to happen." Silence rippled through the room. Sterling stiffened. "That is a serious accusation," Sterling said coldly, "and entirely unsubstantiated." "Is it?" Julia asked. "Because I have the manifest, and I have the police report filed this morning." "You involved the police?" Sterling stood up, his face reddening. "Are you trying to destroy the stock value completely? We handle these things internally." "Not anymore," Julia said. "I am firing the COO and the Chief of Logistics effective immediately. And Mr. Sterling, I am calling for an independent audit of the board's knowledge of illegal activities." Sterling laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "You can't fire us. We answer to the shareholders. And frankly, little girl, you don't have the muscle to force us out. You're alone." "She's not alone." The voice came from the corner of the room. Everyone turned. Sitting in the shadows, in a chair that had been turned away from the table, was a man. He stood up and walked into the light. He was in his late 30s, wearing a black tactical shirt and dark jeans. He had a scruffy beard and eyes that were intensely, unsettlingly blue. He moved with the grace of a predator. "Who are you?" Sterling demanded. "Security. How did this man get in here?" "My name is Grant Solace," the man said. His voice was gravelly. "And I got in because Henry gave me a key 10 years ago." Julia looked at him. She recognized the name. Grant Solace was a legend in the company, a troubleshooter Henry had used for difficult problems overseas. He had vanished 2 years ago. "Grant," Sterling said, his voice losing some of its bluster. "I thought you were in Yemen." "I was," Grant said. He walked over to Julia and stood beside her. He wasn't guarding her. He was standing with her. "Henry called me back 3 weeks before he died. He told me he was changing his will. He told me a storm was coming." Grant dropped a heavy file on the table. It landed with a loud thud. "What is that?" Cynthia asked. "That," Grant said, "is the shadow ledger." Julia bluffed about last night. "Except this one is real. Henry kept it. It details every kickback Kincaid paid to Richard, and every bribe Richard paid to members of this board to look the other way." Grant looked directly at Sterling. "It has dates, times, and offshore account numbers, William. You bought a villa in Tuscany the same week the syndicate started moving guns through our Mexico hub. Sterling sank back into his chair, his face pale. Henry wanted Julia to lead, Grant said, addressing the room. He knew she was the only one with the moral compass to clean this filth out. I am here to ensure she survives long enough to do it. Grant turned to Julia. You're the boss, Mrs. Caldwell. What do you want to do with them? Julia looked at the terrified faces of the board members. The power dynamic had flipped in seconds. She wasn't the waitress anymore. She was the executioner. Mr. Sterling, Julia said softly, you have 5 minutes to resign. If you don't, Grant hands that file to the FBI. Sterling looked at the file, then at Grant, and finally at Julia. He realized he had lost. Fine, Sterling spat, gathering his things. But you're making a mistake. Kincaid won't stop because you fired a few board members. You've just cut off his inside men. He's going to come for you directly now. Let him come, Julia said. As the boardroom cleared out, leaving only Julia and Grant, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving Julia exhausted. Did Henry really call you? Julia asked Grant. He did, Grant said. He poured 2 cups of water and handed one to her. He said you were stronger than you looked. He was right. I don't feel strong, Julia admitted. I feel like I'm waiting for a bullet. That's a healthy way to feel, Grant said grimly, because Kincaid is going to retaliate. He's not a businessman, Julia. He's a butcher. And since you embarrassed him at the docks and cut off his board access, he's going to try to hurt you where you're vulnerable. I have no family left, Julia said. I have nothing he can leverage. Grant looked at her with a strange expression. You have Richard. I don't care about Richard, Julia said. He made his bed. Kincaid thinks you do, Grant said. He thinks you're still the loyal wife. And he knows Richard is the weak link. If Kincaid gets to Richard, he can force him to sign documents, challenge the will, or lie to the police to frame you. As if on cue, Julia's cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered it, putting it on speaker. Julia? It was Beatrice. She was sobbing hysterically. Julia, please, you have to help us. Beatrice? Julia asked. What's wrong? They took him, Beatrice screamed. Men in masks. They broke into the hotel room. They took Richard. They said they're going to send him back to us in pieces unless you bring the ledger to the old shipyard by midnight. Julia looked at Grant. His face was grim. It's a trap, Grant whispered. Please, Julia, Beatrice begged. I know we were horrible to you, but he's my son. Please. The line went dead. Julia lowered the phone. They have Richard. If you go, Grant said, checking the magazine of a handgun he produced from his waistband. There is a 90% chance we don't walk out. And if we don't go, Julia asked. Then they torture Richard to death and send you the video, Grant said matter-of-factly. Julia closed her eyes. She hated Richard. He had abused her, cheated on her, and tried to rob her. But she wasn't a killer, and she wasn't Kincaid. She opened her eyes. We need a plan. Grant cracked a small, dangerous smile. Now you're talking like a CEO. The location Beatrice had given them was the abandoned Blackwood dry dock, a skeletal industrial graveyard on the far south side of the city. It was a place where stripped ships went to rust, a maze of jagged metal and shadows. Grant drove a nondescript sedan he had pulled from the company's off-book fleet. He parked half a mile away, killing the lights. Stay here, Grant said, checking the slide of his pistol. I'll go in, locate Richard, and signal. No, Julia said, her voice tight but firm. Beatrice said I had to bring the ledger. If they don't see me, They kill him. And as much as I despise Richard, I won't have his blood on my hands." Grant looked at her, the rain drumming softly on the roof of the car. He saw the tremble in her hands, but her eyes were steady. "You're brave, Julia. But bravery without training gets people killed. Stick to my back. If I say run, you run. You don't look back. You don't ask why. You just run." "I understand," she said. They moved through the shipyard in silence. The storm had reduced to a freezing drizzle, turning the ground into a sludge of oil and mud. Grant moved like a ghost, guiding Julia through gaps in the chain-link fences and behind rusted shipping containers. They reached the main hangar, a cavernous structure with a corrugated tin roof that groaned in the wind. Inside, a single floodlight illuminated the center of the concrete floor. Richard was there. He was tied to a wooden chair, his face bruised, his expensive suit torn. Beatrice was pacing back and forth next to him, wringing her hands, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. Standing in the shadows behind them were 4 men. Kincaid was leaning against a stack of pallets, smoking a cigarette, looking bored. "We're exposed," Grant whispered. "It's a kill box." "I have to go out there," Julia whispered back. She clutched the briefcase Grant had prepared. It contained stacks of blank paper, with only the top few sheets being genuine printouts from the ledger. "Wait for my signal," Grant commanded. He slipped away into the darkness, scaling a stack of crates to get a vantage point. Julia took a deep breath. She stepped out of the shadows and walked into the circle of light. "I'm here!" she called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. Richard's head snapped up. "Julia, give them the book. Just give it to them." Beatrice stopped pacing and looked at Julia with a mix of relief and something else, something sharper. "Do you have it? Did you bring the original?" Kincaid pushed off the pallets and clapped his hands slowly. "The widow arrives." "Punctual." "I appreciate that." "Let them go," Julia said, holding the briefcase tight. "The ledger for Richard and Beatrice. That was the deal." "The deal has changed," Kincaid said, walking closer. His shoes crunched on the gravel. "You see, Richard here has been telling me stories. He says you don't really have the stomach for this. He says you're a charity case, who got lucky." "Richard says a lot of things," Julia replied coldly. "Most of them are lies." "He also mentioned," Kincaid continued, stopping 10 feet away, "that this shadow ledger is the only copy, which means if I kill you and take the bag, my problems disappear." "If you kill me," Julia said, "my associate releases the digital backup to the FBI. You have 5 minutes to clear out." Kincaid laughed. "Your associate? You mean the washed-up mercenary hiding in the rafters?" Julia's blood ran cold. Kincaid snapped his fingers. High above, on the catwalk, a muzzle flash lit up the dark. Bang! Grant's body tumbled from the shadows, hitting the top of a shipping container with a sickening thud before rolling onto the concrete floor. He didn't move. "Grant!" Julia screamed. "Now," Kincaid said, pulling a gun from his coat. "The briefcase." Julia backed away, clutching the case. She looked at Richard. "You told them? You told them about Grant?" Richard looked down, unable to meet her eyes. I had to, Julia. They were going to cut off my fingers. I had to tell them who was helping you." "You coward," Julia whispered. "Stop stalling," Beatrice shrieked. She ran toward Julia, her face twisted in a rictus of greed. "Give me the case. Once we destroy it, the company goes back to the family. That was the agreement." Julia froze. "The agreement?" She looked from Beatrice to Kincaid. "You weren't kidnapped." Beatrice stopped, realizing she had said too much. She straightened her coat, regaining a shred of her haughty composure. "It was a necessary negotiation, Julia." We hired Mr. Kincaid to apply pressure. You were supposed to be scared into signing the rights back to Richard. No one was supposed to get hurt. You staged this? Julia asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. You set me up to be murdered. Not murdered, Beatrice insisted. Just removed from power. But you're so stubborn. Why couldn't you just take the $5,000 and leave? Enough family therapy, Kincaid interrupted, racking the slide of his pistol. Mrs. Caldwell, you hired me to get the ledger and the company back. I'm doing that, but the price has gone up. No witnesses. Beatrice's eyes went wide. What? No, that wasn't the deal. You can't hurt Richard. We're the clients. Your loose ends, Kincaid said calmly. He raised the gun, aiming not at Julia, but at Richard. No, Beatrice screamed, throwing herself in front of her son. Bang! Beatrice collapsed, a bloom of red spreading across her chest. Richard screamed, a high-pitched, animalistic sound. He thrashed in his chair, tipping it over, scrambling backward in the dirt like a worm. Julia stood paralyzed. The brutality was absolute. Kincaid turned the gun toward her. Goodbye, Mrs. Caldwell. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked from the floor, not from Kincaid, but from the body near the shipping container. Kincaid jerked, his shoulder exploding in a spray of blood. He dropped his gun, staggering back. Grant was alive. He had taken the fall, rolling with the impact, and played dead. Now, he was sitting up, his weapon trained on Kincaid's men. Get down, Grant roared. Julia dropped to the pavement just as the air filled with lead. Grant fired with terrifying precision. Pop, 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 pop. Two of Kincaid's thugs dropped. Kincaid, clutching his bleeding shoulder, scrambled behind a pillar. Kill them! Kill them all! Grant was moving now, limping slightly but fast. He grabbed Julia by the collar of her jacket and dragged her behind a heavy steel generator. Bullets sparked off the metal, whining like angry hornets. I thought you were dead, Julia cried, pressing her hands over her ears. Kevlar vest, Grant grunted, reloading. Still hurt like hell. We need to move. I can't hold them off forever. Richard, Julia pointed. We can't leave him. Richard was still tied to the chair, lying on his side in the open, sobbing next to his mother's body. The bullets were chewing up the ground around him. He set us up, Julia, Grant yelled over the gunfire. He's the reason we're here. He's a witness, Julia shouted back, grabbing Grant's arm. If he dies, Kincaid spins this. If he lives, he goes to prison and takes the syndicate down with him. I need him alive to clear my name. Grant looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. It wasn't mercy. It was strategy. Fine, Grant spat. Cover your ears. Grant stood up and unleashed a barrage of suppressive fire. Go, drag him. Julia sprinted from cover. She stayed low, the wet concrete scraping her palms. She reached Richard. Get up! She screamed, grabbing the back of his chair. Mum! Mum! Richard was catatonic, staring at Beatrice. She's gone, Richard. Move or you're next. Julia grabbed his collar and pulled with all her strength. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Bullets pinged off the ground inches from her feet. She dragged him foot by agonized foot towards the side exit Grant had pointed to. Grant fired his last magazine, pinning Kincaid down, then turned and ran, limping heavily, following Julia. They burst out of the side door into the cold night air. The car was too far. The canal, Grant ordered. They scrambled down a muddy embankment toward the dark water of the industrial canal. There was a small maintenance skiff tied to a rotting pier. Grant shoved Richard, still tied to the chair, into the bottom of the boat. He helped Julia in, then untied the rope. As the boat drifted into the current, the hangar door burst open. Kincaid stood there, his suit ruined, blood dripping from his arm. He raised his gun, firing blindly into the dark, but the current had already taken them. They drifted silently under the rusting hull of a massive tanker, disappearing into the shadows of the harbour. Julia sat in the bottom of the boat, shivering violently. She looked at Richard, who was curled in a fetal position, weeping. She looked at Grant, who was pressing a bandage to his ribs. And then she looked at her hands. They were covered in mud and Beatrice's blood. She hadn't just survived. She had walked into the fire and dragged the truth out with her. For 3 days, Julia was the most wanted woman in Seattle. The media, fed lies by Kincaid's corrupt police contacts, painted her as the Black Widow who had orchestrated the dry dock massacre. Huddled in a safe house, Grant suggested fleeing to Switzerland with the offshore accounts Henry had left her. "Run!" Julia looked at the TV, where William Prescott, the acting chairman, was announcing her firing. "Henry didn't leave me this company to hide. He left it to me to clean it." The next morning, the lobby of Caldwell Tower was a shark tank of reporters. Prescott stood at the podium, feigning grief. "We are cooperating fully to locate the fugitive, Julia Caldwell." The heavy glass doors hissed open. The room fell deathly silent. Julia walked down the center aisle, flanked by Grant and Frank Bishop. But the real weapon was the broken man stumbling between them. Richard. "Security! Arrest her!" Prescott screamed. "Stand down!" Frank Bishop boomed, his team forming a protective wall around the stage. Julia shoved Richard toward the microphone. He looked like a corpse, haunted by the memory of his mother's death. "Tell them, Richard." "It's true," Richard sobbed, his voice cracking on live television. "We hired Kincaid. We staged the kidnapping to get the company back. Kincaid, he killed Mom." Pandemonium erupted. Flashbulbs blinded them. Julia stepped forward, holding up the leather-bound shadow ledger. "This isn't just a family feud," she declared, her voice ringing with steel. "This book contains 10 years of proof, human trafficking, bribery, and the board members who allowed it." She looked directly into the camera lens. "The FBI has the digital copy. It's over." As if on cue, sirens wailed outside, a symphony of justice. Agents swarmed the lobby, handcuffing a pale Prescott. As Richard was led away, his head hanging low, Julia looked up at Henry's portrait on the wall. The storm had finally broken. 6 months later, the rain over Seattle had finally broken, replaced by a crisp, golden autumn. Julia stood in the executive office, looking out at the harbour. The view was the same, but everything else had changed. The port was bustling, but the containers moving through it now carried grain, medical supplies, and legitimate electronics. The shadows had been scrubbed away. On the desk behind her sat a framed document. It wasn't a degree or an award. It was the waiver. The piece of paper she had signed that fateful rainy afternoon, proving she valued her freedom over their fortune. Now, it served as a daily reminder. Money is power, but character is currency. Grant Solace walked in, knocking on the open door frame. He wore a suit now, though he still looked like he'd be more comfortable in tactical gear. He was her chief of operations, the iron fist in a velvet glove that kept the company honest. "The news just broke," Grant said, placing a tablet on her desk. The jury returned the verdict. Victor Kincaid got 3 consecutive life sentences. The syndicate is dismantling. "And Richard?" Julia asked, her voice steady. 20 years. "He took the plea," Grant replied. "He's asking for a visitor, Julia." Julia looked at the waiver, then out at the city. She thought about the man she had married, the man who had laughed when she signed away her rights. She thought about Beatrice, whose greed had become her grave. "No," Julia said softly. "I have a board meeting in 10 minutes. We're launching the new scholarship fund for the dock workers' children. I don't have time for ghosts." She picked up her pen, the same pen she had used to sign the waiver, and signed the authorization for the scholarship. Henry Caldwell had left her an empire built on mud and blood, but Julia had turned it into stone. She wasn't just the sole heiress anymore. She was the architect of a new future. And this time, no one was laughing. What a ride. From a coerced signature in a lawyer's office to a shootout at the docks, Julia proved that sometimes the only way to win everything is to be willing to walk away with nothing. Richard and Beatrice thought they held all the cards, but they forgot that greed blinds you to the traps right in front of your feet. Henry Caldwell played one final chess game from the grave, and checkmate was sweeter than anyone could have imagined. I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in Julia's shoes, would you have signed that waiver to escape a toxic family, or would you have fought them in court from day one? Let me know what you would have done. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and redemption, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on the next dramatic saga. We have a crazy revenge story coming up next week that involves a cheating husband and a lottery ticket. And trust me, you do not want to miss it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.